Previously, I threw estimates under the bus. Today, we look at what I and many of you consider to be the most valuable part of Agile estimating, the process of estimating itself, what I like to call the estimating conversation. We'll also look at what I consider to be a better conversation. Welcome to Development That Pays. My name is Gary Strawn, and I wonder, are you familiar with the saying, cutting the Gordian knot? Thanks to, well, it might have been you. I now have a perfect example of what that phrase or saying means. So 3 years ago, I concluded that estimates in an agile world are perhaps evil. If you saw the previous episode, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And given the conclusion that I'd come to, I started wondering if perhaps we could do without estimates altogether. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that we produce estimates as a way of predicting the future. Everything from selecting the right amount of work for the next sprint, if you're doing Scrum, all the way through to long-term forecasting. Now, here's the thing. It turns out that you don't need estimates for either of those things. Yes, I know that is quite controversial. I will be explaining myself in much more detail in another episode, but for now, work with me here. Assume what I have just said is true, that we don't actually need estimates. And there's a problem there, and certainly I saw this problem very clearly 3 years ago, that if we don't need estimates, then we don't need to do estimating. And I found what I now describe as the estimating conversation to be incredibly valuable in understanding the work. And in a recent survey, many of you agreed that the estimating conversation was the most valuable part. So what to do? Well, to me, my task was clear. All I had to do was to find an alternative to the estimating conversation. A knotty problem indeed, and it never occurred to me there might be a simple and elegant solution until I read this in those survey results. Some of my teams estimate but dump all the numbers after that because the value for the team is created by the discussion, not the numbers. So there it is, a textbook example of cutting the Gordian knot. I just wish I'd come across it, 3 years ago. But although I am impressed with its simplicity and elegance, I'm still not completely happy. You see, if we're still estimating, we're still producing estimates. And if we're still producing estimates, can we really guarantee they won't leak out into the world? And even if they don't, they still have the potential to do harm. More on that in a moment. There's another reason that I'm not entirely happy with the Gordian knot cutting approach, and that is that the estimating conversation isn't quite as good as we think it is. Now, yes, it does have gamification on its side. Equipping each member of the team with a pack of planning poker cards is a neat way of improving team engagement. And when the cards are shown, and if there's a difference of opinion, it's an opportunity for the team to improve its understanding of the task in hand. I'd go further and say that the use of the Fibonacci series on those planning poker cards is a nice touch, helping us to stay with ballpark rather than accurate estimates. But the abstract nature of the story point itself is a barrier to entry, and that's putting it mildly. Perhaps you've forgotten how difficult it was to stop thinking in terms of time. You have stopped thinking in terms of time, haven't you? And perhaps you've also forgotten about the calibration process you had to go through to determine the size of a story point for your team. There's a lot of cognitive load tied up in that concept and use of the story point. There's another aspect to the estimating conversation that is far from ideal, and that is the problem of anchoring. It's the tendency to give too much weight to the first number put forth in the discussion and then inadequately adjust from that starting point. the starting point known as the anchor. Why might this be relevant? Well, even if the estimate never leaves the room, it leaves an impression on those that produced it, which can impact how they approach development when the ticket is finally picked up. For example, a developer picking up a large story point item is expecting to do a lot of work, and that might blind him or her to an elegant solution or shortcut. To give you my assessment of that estimating conversation: gamification, good. Fibonacci series, goodish. Pretty much everything else, not good. Now, you've been very patient, but I think it's high time I introduced you to a better conversation. It is called, drumroll please, story slicing. Now, stay with me here. Chances are you're already familiar with story slicing. You might even be doing it, but perhaps like me, you've underestimated the full power of story slicing. Now, on the face of it, story slicing is pretty much how it sounds. We take a story and figure out how to split it, divide it, slice it, with a very important caveat. The slicing must be vertical, meaning that each of the resulting slices is potentially releasable, a complete story in its own right. Now, story slicing is one of those things that is as much art as science. And if you were aware of it before today, chances are that you're also aware of the multitude of slicing approaches / strategies / heuristics. I'll put just a selection of them somewhere on the screen. Now, no one likes a good heuristic. I do like saying that, heuristic, more than I do. But in focusing on the various slicing approaches, I sort of missed the wood for the trees. It took me way too long to realize that story slicing was actually the better conversation that I'd been seeking. Let me show you. The estimating conversation starts with this question: can we understand this story? Can we understand this story well enough to assign a story point value to it? The story slicing conversation, on the other hand, starts with this question: can we split this story? What might be counterintuitive is that you don't need to fully understand a story in order to split it. Let's run through a quick example. Looking at this story, the team quickly identifies 4 sub-stories. The team spots that 2 of those sub-stories can be split further. So now we have 4 sub-stories. I'm going to highlight the stories at the bottom of this tree, the leaf stories at the end of each branch. Notice that building all of the leaf stories is equivalent to building the entire granddaddy story that we started off with. Okay, next step. Chances are that not all of the leaf stories are buildable right now. We know from Invest that we want stories that are independent. These 2 leaf stories have dependencies, so I'm going to set them aside for now, leaving 4 leaf stories that are buildable now. So far, so good. We've got here in very little time using very little brain power, low cognitive load, and that, you'll be pleased to know, continues. Chances are that not all 4 leaf stories are created equal. We might decide, and it would be no bad thing, to set 3 of them aside for later, leaving just 1 item for now. And now, since we're about to build this story, we need to turn our attention to understanding it in detail. Question: how much easier is it going to be to reason about this story versus the big story that we started with? Not only is it much smaller, it is completely free, as we now know, of dependencies. I'll leave you to ponder that for a second while I address a concern you're likely to be having. So far, I have taken one big story, sliced it up into 6 pieces, identified dependencies, and singled one out for inspection. And naturally, you're asking what happened to the other 5 stories. 2 things to say about that. They may have gone away, or they may go away at some point in the future. One of the many benefits of story slicing is that it allows us to cherry pick. Take a big story, break it apart, pick the best bits, then go and find another big story, split it apart, find the best bits again, cherry picking all the way. Second point, and if you've been multitasking, come back to me now. Let's say we do decide to build all 6 of those leaf stories, meaning that we have 6 easy, quick, low cognitive load conversations. I say that because each conversation is about a story that's both small and entirely free of dependencies. And no, I didn't just pull a fast one. In the case of these 2, we delay the conversations until their dependencies have been met. Compare and contrast that with the estimating conversation, the one big story that the team has to understand, a story with a fair bit of complexity. What the team doesn't know, but we do, is that there are 6 elements hiding inside. The members of the team won't be aware of it, but they're mentally juggling 6 elements, plus the interaction between those elements. That's a lot of cognitive load, exhausting and time-consuming. As I'm sure you've noticed, I've been talking, because it suited my purposes, as if the estimating conversation and the story slicing conversation were separate, distinct, never to be combined, which is, of course, ridiculous. An estimating conversation can and should lead to stories being split, and the story slicing conversation can lead to a story point estimate, which brings us neatly back to invest. Get good at story slicing and all of your stories will be small. And if all of your stories are small, why would they need to be estimable? We'll talk more about that in the next episode, which might be this one right here.